It's pretty interesting stuff. I didn't realize we were as culturally diverse as we are in Port Orchard in comparison to the other cities in the county. I mean, I mean, we're predominantly white, but obviously.
I did too. I thought those statistics were very informative. I enjoyed reading it. Yeah.
Okay, we are recording. You can take it away.
Okay, we'll start here. Welcome everyone to the May 18th, 2020 Economic Development and Tourism Committee meeting. Looks like our entire committee is present. In addition, we've got staff, Nick Bond present, Carrie Salee present, we got Mayor Patonsu present, and also joined by Ryan Hayter, Jack Edwards, and Mitch, I'm sorry, your last name, is it?
Potachik, no worries.
Potachik, perfect, I like it. We'll never make that mistake again. And Brandy's here
no
as
worse
well.
than Patonsu or Kachardi.
That's right. That's right.
Yes.
And if you're all looking at your agenda, our first agenda item today is a business community discussion. Who is going to be leading this today?
Sean, what we've done in the past, the representatives from the Port Orchard Bay Street Association and the Chamber, and Jack always comes, and a few others, and we just allow them to bring up anything that they wish to bring up.
Great. Well, then we will open the floor for comments on here.
Almost like a public comment period.
Right.
I just want to thank Carrie for inviting Fred Caracas to the meeting. I told Rob that Fred actually waylaid me as I was trying to keep my distance and walk my dogs one day. He was very concerned, of course, about the closures, and he wanted, well, I actually wish he was here to speak for himself of what he wants, but he was hoping, it seems, that the city would do something different than whatever the governor and the state would do. And I could just listen sympathetically. I believe he was given the number to call in, and I have a feeling he may not.
He was given the number and the meeting ID and the password. He did not want me to email him any information or send him an Outlook invite. So I hope he wrote it down correctly. I tried to get it to him.
You know, Fred, I get emails and phone calls on both sides of this issue every day. You know, that the governor's, this is too restrictive, or, you know, we're not doing enough to protect people, or they support what the governor's doing. You know, it's the governor's order, and, you know, I wouldn't, it'd be a council decision to defy that. You know, I wouldn't recommend that course, but, you know, my personal opinion on the matter, you know, why, in particular in retail, why is one retail better than or different than any other retail? Once again, we don't get to make that call, and we've got the big box stores that are open, but if the small retailer was using the same precautions, why couldn't they be open? But that's an opinion, and you know, I'll leave it at that.
And I think, not that I'm speaking on behalf of the entire council, but I think there's a sentiment in the council that we do not want to make any differing, I guess, policy changes other than what's coming out of the governor's office at this point. And so we're hoping that this will continue to loosen up. I think June 1st could be a key date where some retail could start conducting business, you know, on a restricted base, but at least be able to start opening their doors is what I'm hearing. Once we get into phase 2.
Yeah, I too have had businesses contact me, and I typically repeat everything that you guys have said. I also direct them to our legislative representatives from the 26th district. I also encourage them, if they feel that their particular sector is being discriminated against, that they put together a plan that they can live with, and that their particular sector can live with, and offer that to the legislators to bring forward. So I'm in agreement with what Sean said. My position as a council member is I'm not going to support something different than what the state has directed us to do.
Right. Okay, any other discussion items under this first agenda item? Any comments from anybody? Okay, well, we'll move on to number 2, kind of some exciting news. And Mayor, I'll turn it over to you to introduce to us Mr. Ryan Hayter.
Certainly. Ryan's somewhere on the screen here today. The boxes have gotten smaller to the right, but I know he's out there. I saw him getting introduced. And in your packet is an outline of a communications plan that Ryan and I have been working on to put together. And it's very, there's a lot of information in this, and I'll go over it at a high level. The thing he's been helping us with the most here recently is press releases and writing professional press releases. We saw one for the Bethel Roundabout, the state's project there. He's helped me with a couple communications related to, how the city is, open to closed to the public, but we're still conducting businesses and business. And the one he's probably going to help us with next is Stetson Heights, and the planning department and the public works department are in the process of finalizing their permits. And the neighbors that live in the county had some very strict ideas on what should happen with that road for road improvements. And the hearing examiner issued a decision. Well, now the developers designed that based on those decisions, and we have concerns about the road, and we think the citizens out there should too. So before we issue that permit, we're going to probably issue a letter to those homeowners in that area and give them a glimpse of what it is that the developer is going to build before construction actually starts on it. So it's one of the things. But this plan that's been brought forward to you, I thought I'd bring it here to Economic Development and Tourism first. It's a discussion item tomorrow night also at the work study. And the first goal, I'm not going to read this verbatim, but I like the first goal there: become a model for small town success through two-way communication driven by an approachable city government that active and engaged with citizens who play a vital role in decision making. Got a mission statement, and there's going to be audiences, internal and external. And as I go into and anybody that's taken a journalism class, on page 2, you've got, the who, what, where, why, and how that you always address when you write those things. Internal communications, we're going to, we'd like to do a survey sometime in the third quarter of our employees. I did an annual staff meeting this year. I think we're going to continue that and elevate that next spring. And an idea box, and we want to create an internal intranet, and for communicating with our staff is one of our.
I have a question about that.
Mm-hmm.
Is that subject to public records?
I think everything we do is subject to public records.
Just wondered if it was different than the internet, if you had an intranet.
We have an internet site. This is more your time card. So you got a home page that a lot of companies have this, and I had it at the bank where I left. Your timesheet, your benefits. I've been doing a weekly message. It might, instead of me emailing it, it's probably on the front page of this, that type of stuff. So it's communication driven to our employees, but obviously everything we do has a subject to the Public Records Act. External communication, we want, Ryan's envisioning a survey sometime in June, if we can get this rolling. We want to update the images and the visuals in our web page. And Ryan's pointed out, and I agree with him, and Janine's been working on this. Remember, Ryan's going to be the creator of things. Janine is still the person that's in control of what gets posted on our Facebook page, what gets posted. We haven't given Ryan the keys to the house too. He's a welcome guest and he's providing input, but he's not taking over our communications all by himself. So we're going to streamline the website. A very common search is your city council packets. Well, gosh, when we publish those, why aren't they on a link on the very front page where it's one click versus 3 or 4 clicks to find that and to download it? One of the things Ryan and I were even talking about Friday, our Facebook page used to be just one way. And we never respond to comments, but our Facebook page of late has turned into a place for people to rant. And I'm questioning whether we turn the ability to post on our page. People are welcome to rant on their own page, but I'm not sure that the city's page is an appropriate place for that. I'd appreciate, it doesn't have to be today, but probably tomorrow night when we're talking the city council, I'd like some guidance from you guys on what your thoughts are about our Facebook page. It's really there's no different than our web pages. It's just a different tool to push. We push information out is really what we do, and we don't debate on those pages. One of the we struggle with a quarterly newsletter because staff needs to write articles about the different projects. Well, I know enough about most of the projects to talk about them conversationally, and we're going to try out a video newsletter and do pick a project or two, and Ryan and I are going to take a stab at doing a video newsletter. At a high level, that's kind of, I don't know that we're going to be able to get everything done in this plan. And we've got kind of a list of stories we want to highlight on the second to the last page. I don't think we'll get to all of this, but it doesn't hurt to have a plan on all of the things that we want to get done through the end of the year. And so with that, Ryan, what do you have to share to add to this this plan as we've created it?
Oh, thank you, Mayor. Just the overall goal here is to really make the city government approachable in all facets. The city has this really big vision that I didn't even know all of this until I got involved about a month ago. There's so much happening all the time, and we want to make it as easy as possible to share that vision, to make our citizens aware, but also to be the easiest to work with and provide two-way communication so they are truly contributing to what we're doing. And I think it's notable how, even in conversations I'm having, how the city really thinks about every penny that is spent and what impact that's going to have and who it's going to impact. So those are the types of things that we just need to share that I'm not sure in a normal day, you don't think about that. But even in some of the press releases we've written, that there are things we could have included that might have better educated citizens. So when they respond, they're more informed. So I hope that the city can just basically be more informative and easier to work with. With having a communications plan like this, it is going to create more work because it's going to give people more opportunities to participate. So that's another matter that we need to address. That'll be part of the plan, as well as how do we handle communications coming at us.
Go ahead, Fred.
If I could quickly, sorry about this. Also, just since this is an economic development meeting, a big part of this is really sharing the direction that the city is going regarding economic development. And so in the communications plan that's in front of you, there are a few focus stories on the last page, I believe, and that's going to require quite a bit of input in order for us to accurately tell those stories and engage citizens. So there you go.
Fred, you had a comment?
Yeah, I love the plan. I think it's what I've always hoped the city would do. And I'm very excited about you talking about increasing the two-way communication. I have a question, and I've mentioned this to Rob, that several of us, for example, have received a lot of emails. It's a form email, and I'm wondering if there's a way that we could just fashion a response, a very courteous, like, thank you for your response. This is not a city matter. For example, they're talking about their constitutional rights and all that. Is there some way that you could perhaps just create a very nice generic response so they know that we've heard them, but we are not going to be responding to all of their points?
Yes, I have thought about that, and I would like to collect as many emails of these types of emails as possible, or letters, or whatever.
15 of them.
So we don't have so we can have an accurate response, because not all of them. Well, we're not increasing staff in order to respond, and we're going to have a lot more communication. So we need to be clear. We've heard you. We're going to get to this as soon as possible, or we've heard you, and this is not a city matter, but we do suggest that you pursue it in this direction. So still be helpful and accommodating.
You know, the most prominent one we're getting, though, isn't coming from individuals. It's coming from a listserv. Somebody's doing a survey. And so those emails aren't even, if we responded to it, aren't going back to an individual. So possibly the best way to address this is in a press release or a post or a website. We've received a number of concerns, you know, a number of form letters from, you know, concerned citizens, and addressed it holistically versus responding individually to a listserv that I don't think would be very effective. Others have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree, Rob. It's almost spam.
I'll find one and forward it to while you guys continue with the meeting here. I'll find one and forward it to Ryan. I mean, I've got, last week I was getting a half a dozen of them a day.
Yeah,
we all are.
The only difference is that they do include their email address and address, and I think they took the most effort in the subject, because the subject lines are different. The content were basically, there were two basic types of letters.
I never got email addresses. It's a listserv.
Yeah, it's a listserv. They're all the same domain, Fred.
Not the ones that I'm getting. I'm getting them
Really?
from individuals like Taylor Vandy, Michelle Comstock, Marilyn.
At what? What's their email extensions?
Shelley Comstock at gmail.com, Guilfoy at Gmail, or.
Oh, really? I've
Hotmail.
not seen any of those.
I haven't received those, Fred, myself.
Either.
Oh, I'm special, huh?
Well, and some of them I received are not Port Orchard citizens, and that needs to be part of our communication too. Just because you have a Port Orchard address does not mean you live within the city.
Yeah,
And
about
so
a third of them.
need to be directed, you know, elsewhere.
Okay, so Fred, in the Comstock, you're right. In her signature line, she does provide her email address, but it's coming from a listserv, as Sean. So I'll forward this email. They don't. The body of all of these emails are the same. So we get them. They've slowed down now, but last week it was when it has to do with the tracing.
Yep.
Well, even in the future, I would really like to collect all of these just so I can see what's coming in and how it's coming in and who is saying it. Because I'm observing both all of the city's communications and as much public communication as I can to find solutions. So always feel free to forward those to me just so I can be aware and see if we need a response or not.
The challenge too, Ryan, is we have a limit to your contract too, and I don't know that that's going to be the best use of the
or even
dollars we have for you.
Or summarize, just so it's important that I'm aware of those because those are challenges we have to overcome, and we can come up with solutions that we can then use in the future that'll be much more efficient.
Yeah. So I just forwarded it to you a minute ago.
And so that brings up a good question, Rob or Brandy. If we are reaching out or forwarding emails to Ryan, what is the appropriate email address to use?
His city email address.
Okay.
He has one. You're at cityofportland.us.
Let's be sure to bring that up to the full council tomorrow.
Yeah. Yes. Good point.
Great. I can't see everyone's photo. Does anyone else have a question or a comment? Because we're sharing screen, just feel free to chime in on this particular agenda item. I had one. And maybe it's just being a little bit of a nitpicky, but almost at the top of this document under messaging priorities, the first kind of title there was "Be Human," and that just didn't resonate with me. I was wondering maybe there's I love the text under it. I think that's awesome. I just don't think "Be Human" is I don't know. This doesn't resonate with me.
I think maybe be approachable is.
There you go.
But it's really not being a distant, untouchable government.
I love be approachable. I love that.
And we can change it to that, no problem.
Okay. Again, maybe a little nitpicky. It just didn't bounce off of me. So.
Not at all.
Okay.
Can you bring that up again tomorrow night, Sean? Because we've already gone to print with the packet and it has this version.
Okay.
I've made a note. So in this,
I have something.
Paragraph, you want to be us to be somehow incorporate being approachable. Is that okay?
Just the title, just so it resonates, right? So it almost, I don't know,
instead of being
more intuitive.
Okay, instead of being human, it's being approachable.
Right. I mean, what is being human, right? That's such an open-ended statement. Someone else had a comment?
It was me.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, and I'm being nitpicky too, just in the communications mission, it talks about building rapport with the city council, staff, and residents. I think you do need to include the business owners as well, since this is an economic development committee.
Absolutely.
So they like to be definitely kept up to breast of what's going on in the city as well.
Your residents and businesses.
There you go. Good catch, Jack. Thank you. Any other comments before we leave this item? Okay, well, it looks like we're on to our fourth discussion item here. This would be the draft of the draft data from the downtown sub-area plan study. Nick, take it away.
My space bar wasn't working to unmute here. Anyway, Mitch and Mark are here from our team. Mitch is with GGLO and Mark is with Heartland. I think Mark is going to be the one presenting this. This has to do with our economic analysis that is providing input into our planning, our sub-area plan for downtown and the county campus, as well as the planned action EIS. And so if you guys, do you want to share the slide? I believe I can authorize you to display your screen if you want to put up the slideshow and then walk us through what you found.
That would work for me.
Not hearing you, Mark.
You're not? Shoot.
I hear you a little bit. It's very quiet.
I'm going to take you off my headset then.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Yes.
The headset failed me. Sorry. Yeah, I'm happy to share my screen. All right, is everyone seeing that?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. And how much time do you have allotted for this? Or I just want to make sure pacing wise I'm aligning with what I have to work with.
How about would 20 minutes be enough time?
Yeah, that's fine, and that'll there's some content I'll move through fairly quickly, and I think the meat of it is to talk about the capacity analysis we just wrapped up. This initial section of the report is largely focused on profiling where we can the sub area, and otherwise we're profiling the city itself, looking at demographic and economic indicators. And we transition into our capacity analysis. There's a segue there. So I'm going to move through this initial section fairly quickly. Please stop me if there's something you want to speak to specifically. Otherwise, I'll keep rolling through. Is there any additional background anyone needs on the sub-area planning from Mitch, or any questions about our role on this project or where things are at.
I have one question. As you get into some of these statistics or this data, what were the dates, right? How much of this is pre-COVID versus post-COVID?
I will say 100% of it is pre-COVID.
Okay. And so I'm just curious if we've learned anything the last 6 weeks and if there'll be any adjustments moving forward. So go ahead.
Just overall, there's not data for us to be pulling quite yet. Now we're in the market. I actually asset manage several office buildings. We're active in the brokerage community and marketing properties, and we're out there representing ownership. And I can say anecdotally, the impacts are real. I would say just a quick COVID-19 precursor to this is a lot of those impacts are a bit unknown and to play out right now. So there's not good data. It's not showing up in the data sets that we typically pull from as of yet. But we know that multifamily is holding up a little bit better in terms of just commercial real estate. Office is taking a hit. There's lots of businesses that are being directly impacted by this. And so you're seeing office portfolios with abatements, rent deferments, and then of course retail has taken the brunt of this, retail and hospitality. And those industries are going to be really hit hard for a long time. And I guess from a timing standpoint, overall, there's some short-term impacts we're seeing right now. We're experiencing them. Some things are starting to open up that we've been feeling for a couple of months, and we will continue to feel for a couple of months. But there are long-term implications across how real estate is utilized, especially in the office world, that we'll be feeling for years to come, we think. How that'll play out is, we don't have the crystal ball for that, but how companies and users are going to be thinking about how they use space, how much space they need, is going to be an impact. And then also just the recovery and slowdown in economic activity. That's going to slow down investment in certain product types. So that's a little precursor to this. But I would emphasize that none of this represents that COVID-19 market. And that the next 6 months will really be where that data starts becoming available, and you can see the dramatic impact on local lease rates, vacancy rates, those kinds of things. So this is let's see here. This is the presentation or the report that we've produced. It's broken out into a focus on population and housing, workforce and employment. We take a look at real estate market indicators, and then we dive into our capacity analysis that's being used as part of the sub-area planning process to help evaluate growth in the sub-area and where that might occur, essentially. And that lands in essentially 3 scenarios that we can focus on, and I could describe how we landed those 3 capacity scenarios. So in terms of walking through these initial slides, we use what I call a comparison city framework to provide some context for Port Orchard and how it's compared to other regional indicators and local cities and municipalities. We look at the indicators. We like to look at population growth. We look at forecasts. From a demographic standpoint, we selected to look at a lot of the household composition data, housing tenure, so owner-occupied versus renter-occupied. We also looked at race and ethnicity, household incomes, educational attainment. And then part of our scope was to conduct a housing inventory. So we did a detailed dive, and this kind of fed into our capacity analysis. We did a detailed dive into your existing housing inventory within the sub-area itself, and broke that out to what you have from a standpoint of single, multifamily, different housing typologies and products. Just to give a good profile for Mitch and the rest of the team and the city to understand what's happening in the sub-area right now.
So Mark, this early data is citywide, and then later we get into the sub area, correct?
Yeah, so a lot of this data, especially the population demographic data, is just not available at a customized geography quite like the sub area. And we explored segmenting this out to try to better represent the downtown area. It's difficult. So most of these indicators are citywide. So we're comparing Port Orchard as a city. It's a little bit tricky, and obviously it would be nice to be able to have really micro level data on some of these indicators, but that's just not quite possible, or the level of accuracy would be questionable. So that's a good distinction. I would say the housing inventory is very much sub-area as well as the real estate indicators. So looking at population growth, generally speaking, the city's grown at a healthy clip. This growth rate of 2.9% annually over the last 10 years does include a couple of annexations, one in 2012 that was somewhat larger. You annexed a decent amount of population, but even so, you're still growing as a city. And you've added over 3,000 residents since 2010. And thinking of that, how much growth will occur in the future in the rest of the city versus your downtown, these are the kind of things to be thinking about as part of the sub-area plan, and how much you can accommodate, which we'll get to. In terms of forecasted population, Port Orchard, the PSRC, Puget Sound Regional Council, their last forecast called for just over 7,000 residents to be moving to the city of Port Orchard over the next 20 years. Sorry about that. That's a 1.9% annual growth rate. So similar, a little bit less than what you've been experiencing over the last 10 years. So essentially, where can you fit these 7,000 residents? Where are they going to go? How does your sub-area plan, your downtown fold into this capacity? These numbers will be revisited, the forecasts. So new forecasts will be produced by PSRC, and it'll be interesting to see how much that changes and how much it doesn't. We looked at household composition. I'm going to move through these fairly quickly. I'm happy to circle back on any of these, but just in the interest of time. We looked at household composition. It's largely non-family households, a higher percentage than you're finding elsewhere in the region compared to other cities. It's about 68% of households in Port Orchard. And looking at housing tenure, owner-occupied versus non-owner occupied, you're pretty close to the rest of the county in terms of average. More owner occupied than you'd find, for example, across the water in Bremerton. Looking at age, the thing that stood out to us here was that you have a higher percentage of folks between 24 and 44, which is kind of a targeted demographic than you'd find across Kitsap County. Nothing super strong stood out to us. Your median age is right there alongside other communities, a little bit younger than you'd find across Kitsap County as a whole. Obviously a lot younger than you'd find in a more retirement-focused communities like Gig Harbor and Poulsbo. Race and ethnicity, you're not diverging much from the other comparison cities and what you'd find in Kitsap County as a whole. You're slightly more diverse in terms of ethnicity and your percentage of not Hispanic or Latino population than you'd find across the county and some of the other comparisons communities we look at. Let's see here. Median household income, this is 2018. This is the most recent data available for all these indicators. Your median household income was just over $70,000, which is right in line with Kitsap County, quite a bit above Bremerton, a bit below cities like Gig Harbor, a bit above Poulsbo, and of course King County, and just showing that as a comparison of where household incomes sit compared to communities across the water. So nothing that stood out to us too much except to say that pretty healthy median household income and in line with what you're finding across the county as a whole. Educational attainment, what stood out to us was that just under 10% of the total population of Port Orchard has now graduated high school. And this is a bit higher than what you're finding elsewhere. And this is population of, I think, 25 and over. A little bit higher population of folks that haven't graduated from high school, but you have a healthy percentage of folks with a college degree or higher education. Then looking at housing units, I'm going to skip forward a little bit. I think I'll speak more to housing when we talk about the housing inventory and what's there in the sub area. Here we go. Looking at housing, this feeds right into our work on your housing capacity, your capacity for growth in the future for the sub area plan itself. The big things that stood out to us is single family housing is the predominant existing land use in the study area, so it's 38% of the land. I would point out, so this is all tailored to the sub-area boundary, these numbers. So 62% of the housing you have is single family. You've got about 74 multifamily units, some condominium units, and then a mix of shared wall, townhouse, or duplex style projects. So that's a big component of our analysis in looking at what you have in this area, what will redevelop, what will it redevelop as likely. So a big chunk of your capacity is and your existing housing is in that form of single family, which I'm sure you all generally knew. So we can talk a little bit more about that when we start looking at the growth scenarios and how we treated single family uses. Any questions on this topic? Okay. So this is just a breakdown by zoning, just where your single family housing is by zone. We did find it interesting that you have a number of single family housing units, single family uses in your more high density mixed use commercial districts. And that is a big factor in how we treated them in our capacity analysis, which I'll speak to. But essentially, single family uses in zones that allow a certain level of high density use or mixed use, we're treating as capacity. So that's a component of your growth is the eventual conversion of single family into new development over time.
Beck, do you have a question?
Well, I was just wondering what percentage in that sub area is government property?
I might have that breakdown later. I don't know.
I looked at the next. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I just was at the slide before the one you're on, and I was just wondering because we have the high school, and I mean we have the government campus. We have a lot of.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what percentage that was. If you had it there, I didn't see it.
I don't know if I have that exact percentage later on in the report when we start looking at the capacity analysis. I might have a breakdown that gets at that. I'm not 100% sure if we calculated that exact number, but yes, a significant port is a significant chunk of the downtown, or the sub area is within government ownership, whether that's port, city, school district.
Yeah.
We can kind of see how that overlays with where we're showing capacity actually. Because there's a bit of your capacity, whether it's pipeline development, things that are planned or not planned, is on government-owned land. There's a part of that. Another indicator we look at from a general economic profile indicator I like to land on is your jobs to housing ratio. That's essentially how many jobs you have to how many housing units you have in a city. It's a good indicator of your relationship to employment. And are you a bedroom community? Are you a job importer, so a major employment center? Or are you something more balanced? And I'd point out that Port Orchard has a good balance in a way that your ratio is 1.3. Obviously, a place like Bremerton that's bringing in so many people to work at the Navy base or the Naval Yard has a higher ratio. And then Gig Harbor has a lot of retail, a small population. So that's an indicator of that. But that 1.3 is a nice balanced ratio. You have obviously a major employment center in your government campus, and there's a number of other private employers. But that was just a kind of summation of what we've been looking at. In terms of what people do for a living, this is occupation of residents in Port Orchard as a whole. You have the highest population working in production, transportation, material living, so about 15% of the people that live in Port Orchard are in that category. And I think that's indicative of folks traveling over and working in Bremerton at the shipping yard and other industrial production type uses. That's a good breakdown of just what people are actually doing for a living, and a decent indicator of where they might be traveling to do that work. Then we actually looked at the actual jobs in Port Orchard, regardless of where people are coming from, with the covered employment within your city. So this is coming from PSRC. This is as of 2018. They may have published 2019 data since I've done this. I hadn't seen it a few weeks ago, but they publish it in the spring typically. I don't know how things have been impacted by COVID-19, but that's a good monitor data source I'm sure that the city's looked at. So you have about 7,500 jobs in the city. This is a breakdown of comparison cities and the number of jobs by major industry. This is just your distribution of jobs. So of the jobs you have in the city, 41% of them are in what's called FIRE, which is finance, insurance, and real estate. And then you have a number of jobs in government, which is 14% of the jobs in the city. And the other major category is retail. So it's the large majority of jobs in the city are in those categories. It's an interesting breakdown when you look at other cities and how that's broken out. Bremerton, obviously 50%. They're putting all of the Navy-based Kitsap jobs in that category of government.
Could you, in a future renditions of this, I jumped to the conclusion that the fire district was a major employer.
I like to include a breakdown of what that means. That's a good point. I'll make note of that. WTU, yeah, we should include the definitions if they're not somewhere else. They're here in this page, but they're not. It's not very legible. I'll add that.
Actually, can you change the acronym from FIRE to maybe REFI?
Sure, yeah. I will say it's just how PSRC produces and talks about it. So it's an acronym that's commonly used, FIRE, amongst data wonks and economic development folks. So it is something that is used across the region as an acronym, FIRE.
Just to make this more user-friendly to the general public, I just assume step away from any acronyms on it.
Yeah. It just gets a little tricky to fit stuff, but I will make sure that's more clear.
Or you've got a table with what they mean at the bottom.
Yeah. I think what I'd like to do is include a note to explain what WTU is, FIRE, all those things. Happy to do it. Then we dove into looking at some of your existing real estate conditions. So we looked at different product types: office, retail, vacancy rates, or multifamily. And these are all the vacancy rate indicators leading up through the end of 2019 into Q1 2020. Obviously, everything's changed a bit, like we were discussing earlier. The effects of vacancy rates in 2020, as that data comes to bear, that'll be really interesting for the city to look at and monitor. Obviously, retail has taken a dramatic hit, and as I don't know what you're hearing about what businesses are going to be able to come back and what aren't, or who are surviving this and who aren't. But that'll be a major component to this. Vacancy rates were fairly low or trending down, leading through 2019 across the city. Office vacancy rates as well, generally pretty low at 5%. These data can be a little bit.
We lost Mark.
We are still waiting for Mark. Is he back? Might be trying to dial back in.
If with your
There he
guys'
is. He's back.
Hi, I'm back. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, sorry about that. I lost connection. Need to reshare my screen now, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I think you were on page 23, I believe, the real estate conditions.
Yes. You guys see my screen?
Yep.
All right. So a lot of this will be in flux. I think office and retail is where we anticipate the most difficult environment for investment and how that can play out in the next, well, short term and long term. Multifamily, we think, is more resilient. There's still housing shortages in the region, including in Kitsap County. Vacancy rates and lease rates were climbing dramatically in this area. So it's something to, we think, closely monitor, but it will impact, especially in downtown, small town, downtown environments, feasibility of this kind of investment, or feasibility of retail and office uses as a component of mixed use products. There'll be challenges with that. These are just taking a look at lease rates and similar trends that relate to vacancy rates. You're seeing a dramatic rise in multifamily rents across the region. Something I'd point out. Median home prices have also been climbing across Kitsap County and the communities we've been looking at. We did want to look at that because that does play into the thinking around a lot of the single family uses in your sub area, but then also just the overall performance of the market in Kitsap County overall is just a good economic indicator for us. And leading up to this, through this work, all signals were pointing to continual price gains. You're seeing a fairly dramatic increase. The impact of COVID-19 on the single-family housing market is starting to play out. The activity and sales activity has picked up, but over the next year, it'll be really interesting to see how that affects the housing supply and how many people are willing to list their homes and pricing as well. This is year-over-year growth on housing. I'll start moving through these a little quicker. So then we started to dive into our capacity analysis. And so the next two maps are kind of segueing into that work. And we started looking at improvement value ratios, both from a couple different angles to inform our capacity analysis. So we looked at, this is a critical input to understand what's vacant, what might be redevelopable, looking at it from the standpoint of what level of investments have been made on a property, how much of a deterrent would those be for future development. And this is a common methodology for buildable lands analysis and capacity analysis throughout the region that municipalities and counties are required to do. So I think I'm ready to dive into the capacity analysis, which is kind of a segue in our scope of work. Is there any questions about our profile work, or do you just want me to keep going and then we can circle back?
Yeah, keep going.
Sounds good. So our capacity analysis, the greenish box is essentially our methodology. These are the steps we took to get into our future capacity scenarios. So we initiate it with a calculation of your gross buildable area. So this includes all vacant and what we're calling redevelopable lands, less some exclusions for parks and essential public facilities that we know shouldn't be considered developable in the future. So that the clearest example of that are, and I'll go through a list of exclusions, is a public park that we know is off the table for future development. I also say that we're not including public rights of way in this. So all the numbers you're looking at are not including the streets. So this is really focused on parcels, essentially. Then we walk through and we do an analysis. We calculate the net developable land area. Essentially what we're doing is deducting for critical areas, future public right-of-way and street dedications that might be required as part of the development of a site, and other public facilities, and also building in what we call a market factor, which is essentially accounting for lands, generally speaking, that even if they are vacant or redevelopable, there's an impact in ownership or other unforeseen circumstances that would impact redevelopability in the future. And so just essentially adding a level of conservatism to it so that we're not overstating capacity. Then we identify capacity by zone. So working with GGLO, they crafted essentially capacity estimates based on current zoning in the shape of floor area ratios. So essentially calculating how much building could you get on a site. And we varied that into a couple of different typologies, looking at it from a surface parking or structured parking scenario. This is really critical in our analysis and how we looked at how the market would support these types of products. So there's a big difference in what a site can hold, or the capacity of a site, if you have surface parking versus structured parking. The capacity and density on site goes up if you're able to do some form of structured parking, whether that's underground or above ground structured or some combination thereof. So that's how we actually structured our market scenarios that we'll walk through. And then we also looked at your current development pipeline supplied by the city, and also looking at some of the market research we had done, building that into this capacity analysis. So if there's a planned project, such as the Kitsap Bank properties, and that master plan, that's built into this in capacity numbers. Those are projects, whether they end up being built or not, they're good indicators of what could be built there in the future. So we go ahead and incorporate those. And then we have 3 scenarios we modeled, kind of a baseline scenario that we think is more reflective of at least current conditions or pre-COVID-19 conditions. Then we have a high growth scenario with more of a residential focus where the predominant uses are residential. And then we have a high growth scenario to reflect similar market conditions, but more of a focus on commercial growth. So where you'd see more standalone office and retail development potentially. And really we crafted those to help inform the sub-area planning process so that when Mitch and team are looking at crafting new regulations and looking at public infrastructure and such, they can have a few different scenarios to evaluate and model. So I'm going to skip forward a little bit in the interest of keeping us moving. To these 2 maps. So this is essentially the land areas where we're showing capacity within the downtown sub-area. And it's essentially the same data viewed in a couple different ways. The first map on the left is showing where capacity is by your general land use. So the crosshatches are where capacity is, whether that's vacant, redevelopable, or pipeline. And then the other is showing, on the right, is showing capacity by whether it's on a vacant or vacant property, or if it's on an underutilized property, or on a single family property in a high capacity zone. It's kind of generally showing where we think growth can occur in the next 20 years in this sub-area, which I think is pretty critical for understanding and developing the sub-area plan itself. These will end up being pretty important. You obviously have some clusters of capacity where development is less concentrated, or there's more potential for development in the future based on the improvements or lack of improvements on the site. Any questions so far? I know I'm working through a lot and this is fairly complicated really quickly. Happy to answer questions, or I can keep going and I can walk through the scenarios and the actual capacity numbers next. I'll keep going.
Yeah, I would just keep going.
So I described these scenarios. Essentially what we're trying to, the box on the right outlines what these scenarios generally represent. If there's any questions about how we came up with these or our approach to these, I'm happy to answer them, but I think I'll just skip into what we're showing actual capacity to be. So this is a summary table of each scenario. So the first table, Exhibit 56, not table, but bar graph, we're showing that there'd be under this baseline capacity scenario, capacity for another additional 1,053 residential units. And under that same baseline scenario, we're showing capacity for just over 580,000 square feet of commercial development. That commercial development is inclusive of, for example, the net increase in square footage at the county campus, county courthouse campus. Scenario 2 is where we're waiting, we're showing reflecting better market conditions, where more structured parking, a greater share of development is built out as structured parking, therefore allowing a greater density. What this would reflect is better market conditions to justify that type of development product, which really doesn't exist yet in Port Orchard. You're seeing that type of development having been done or getting recently done in Bremerton, but essentially podium style mixed use development. This would allow a greater capacity in a lot of your mixed use zones. So we're showing capacity for just over 1,300 residential units. And under that same scenario, because you're achieving greater densities, you're also achieving a higher level of commercial development in the form of more ground floor commercial uses in your downtown. And then the third scenario, we're showing a similar number of residential units. It's the same or a similar level of high density structured parking share. but it's illustrating a higher market scenario where market conditions are better. But a bigger share of development is in the form of commercial, office, retail. So we're showing just over 800,000 square feet of commercial development in that scenario. And we wanted to show that because I know that from an economic development standpoint and from a modeling standpoint for the sub-area planning itself, we wanted to show what that looked like and what that could potentially realistically look like. We think scenario 2 is a good scenario to be looking at from a realistic standpoint. If you start seeing multifamily development and the market really is there for that in a higher density form in your downtown, we think scenario 2 is a good scenario to be looking at. Office and standalone office and commercial, I think, will be challenging. So scenario 3 might not be as realistic, but it's worth looking at and understanding what that looks like. So this is kind of where we landed with everything and what downtown area could accommodate. I'm happy to answer questions, visits, assumptions. I know there's a lot of information to download to you guys so quickly.
Go ahead, Fred.
Can you review on a map where the anticipated residential is going to go? Is it the crosshatched areas, for example, on page 38?
Yeah. So the way this is done is we take the zoning and whatever's allowed there from a use standpoint, which is a mix of commercial and residential. And then we apply, based on GGLO's calculations, what an appropriate building density would be, or a floor area ratio is what they estimated, depending on the type of development product. So whether it would be surface or structured parking. And I will note that there are a number of surface parking lots that we're showing as development capacity that are prized parking. And I certainly understand that may not be realistic to see those development in the near term, but we often like to include surface parking because it serves as a good form of land banking for a long-term outlook like this.
I'm noticing on this map, and I didn't notice it when I looked at this slideshow last week, but like the West Bay Center, which is the kind of the far upper right of our study area where the big white roof is not shown as residential capacity. And also there's the 100 Bethel property just to the south of that is also not shown as having residential capacity. And I know that there are developers talking about those two projects. Also, the far west of the site along the waterfront, we're actually going to hearing next month on, I think, 40 apartments to redevelop a site that is not shown as redevelopable.
Where's that one?
The far west on the water.
That one was included in the pipeline already.
Okay, so that project, so this does not include pipeline developments. And that project you're speaking to was included. We did not include any pipeline, or we didn't see the pipeline for this northeastern site.
So under the numbers where you had 1,300 new residential units under alternative 2, did that 1,300 include pipeline, or was that just purely capacity?
That includes that, then we reincorporate the pipeline into that. So that includes all of the units planned, for example, at the Kids at Bank properties, plus the development you just mentioned.
Okay, thank you.
And my guess, Nick, and correct me if I'm wrong, Bethel probably could be considered pipeline. It's probably as conceptual as maybe some of the stuff the bank's even doing, but West Bay is probably farther into the future than 100 Bethel. And maybe they both just need to be in the capacity.
Yeah, and I think that's always a tricky part with this is there are properties, we looked at that, and essentially our challenge was that it's not quite meeting the threshold of our improvement value. The improvements there are valuable. It's an occupied building. I totally understand that looks like a good piece of real estate to redevelop, and it sounds like someone else does too. So, if we want to include it in the pipeline, I think that's a good way to show that as capacity. I
don't think West Bay is pipeline. It's farther reaching because it is leased up now. The 100 Bethel is what I was referring to, which is a vacant building.
And that's just right. Okay, 100 Bethel.
Yeah, it's just up from there.
We can certainly add that. if you've got some information on what that project would be in terms of units, we can.
Nick may.
What's that?
Nick might have it. If anybody's got it, Nick has it. But
Yeah,
it may be just more including it in the development capacity is a definite.
Yeah, you can follow up with me offline. But I did have one more question. So we were talking about doing the planned action EIS and sort of setting a level of development which the EIS would cover. And so we've started identifying commercial square footage and residential units. And so presumably we're getting close to the point where we would want to start defining how many residential units could be permitted under the planned action EIS and how much commercial square footage. Is that a correct assumption?
Yeah, I think these would be the numbers you'd use. I think you'd want to look at each scenario and what you think from an EIS standpoint makes sense to plan for, and what area the EIS is covering. Is the planned action EIS going to be for the entire sub area, or is that?
Yeah, so
go ahead.
Programmatically for the entire sub area, and then there'd be a specific portion of it for the redevelopment areas. And so I think to expand on the point, this is the foundational starting point for that planned action EIS, but then it would also include additional redevelopment areas included within that redevelopment plan. So essentially you're swapping out some of these parcels for additional planned pipeline within that sub-area plan. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I want to make sure that my council members and Mr. Edwards understands the idea of the planned action EIS is that we're going to develop a plan for a certain level of development, and we're going to do environmental review on the plan so that each individual development doesn't have to go through environmental review on its own. So we're going to front load the public comment period and the identification of mitigation for impacts of these projects, and it will streamline the development process.
Yeah,
that's great.
And as part of our package, we're going to have, which will, once we add this pipeline in, we'll make this pipeline adjustment. We'll be handing over the GIS information, the shapefile essentially with this, along with the spreadsheet model that we've created to Mitch and the team, and they can hopefully leverage that too throughout this process. So that, yeah, being the foundation of the EIS work. So we've kind of tailored it to be compatible with that process.
I think it's interesting, some of these scenario 1, 2 versus 3, and kind of, again, this was kind of pre-COVID. And I think coming out of here, I think, not that all of us have a crystal ball, but I think, going a little more heavy on residential makes a lot of sense. I think we're going to have telecommuting options like we've never seen before.
And overall, from a standpoint of a market supported use, you're on the cusp, especially with some of the pipeline items where, investors are willing to take the leap and build essentially a more expensive product, a higher density podium style product. You were on the cusp of that. And we think, putting aside COVID-19 and maybe that there's a delay because of that, it's the most viable use in terms of redevelopment that you'd likely see in downtown, especially with the amenities you're creating, the access to the ferry, telecommuting now. Still a strong use and something we think would be viable in the long term.
Beck, did you have a comment?
Well, I do. I just want to make sure I understand this map better, the one that's on page 38. When I'm looking at this, is it the particular parcels with the slotted lines across them where we would expect more density than is what they're now? Is that where we would expect multifamily, or in the entire residential area would we expect multifamily?
The cross-hatched areas are the parcels after our evaluation and based on the level of improvements where we'd expect, where we're showing you have capacity for development.
That's where we would anticipate a change in what is happening now on that land.
And essentially, I think one of the bigger, more unique components of our work in the sub area is the amount of single family you have. So we showed a large majority of your single family will under looking at a variety of thresholds around value and how much of that would actually flip in the long term with the zoning you have in place. We took the approach of saying that any single family use in a high density zone, we think should be treated as long-term capacity. Now, we don't have a crystal ball to say that, yes, that'll redevelop for sure, but we think it's a reasonable assumption. So those blue parcels on the map to the right are where there's a single family use currently. So you'd see some conversion to some higher density housing on some of those single family properties, but a large majority of them we're not showing as capacity, at least for the purposes of sub-area planning. But yeah.
So I'm looking at the map and I'm seeing a few more issues that we probably need to go over, just staff with the consultant. But for instance, the waterfront parking in front of the marina, I don't think that's likely going to be capacity for anything other than sewer lift station and some park type uses. I think also the properties next to Marina Park are shown as capacity, and it's pretty unrealistic to expect that we're going to see the construction of new buildings there. Likewise, the Bay Ford dealership, there's a crosshatch there. So the existing dealer is not shown as redeveloping, even though there are permits right now that are likely going to expire. But that entire site, including the gray crosshatch, was supposed to redevelop as a car dealership. Now that's sort of up in the air, but I would say that the entire site, including the car dealership, is probably redevelopment capacity. So I think we should hone in on a couple of these properties and probably Carrie, Mark, Mitch, and I need to sit down and really look a little bit more closely at the parcel level to make sure that what we're showing kind of reflects the knowledge that we have. And then the other point I wanted to make is that in terms of helping things along, we were discussing at Land Use Committee the multifamily tax exemption tool, and we were looking at a different ways to use that tool. And one of the ways that we were looking at was to try to encourage redevelopment in areas like this. And so I think this exercise is maybe a good way to kind of identify where that tool could be used to help podium style mixed use development, to help sort of subsidize those construction costs a little bit, or where you have an underutilized parcel where maybe there is an existing structure that needs to be torn down. Maybe that tool gets applied in some of these areas as a way to help incentivize some redevelopment to a more intense, higher value use.
I can say anecdotally, in my experience, that it's an effective program. Just down the highway in Tacoma, it's been highly successful, and there's different approaches to how you implement it. I do think it's an absolutely worthwhile program. It can make the difference. It's not necessarily something that's going to take a super challenging project to make it work, but it can be enough to kind of push something over the edge to that higher density product you're looking for.
Was there any consideration of the potential in residential in the yellow areas for people possibly building an accessory dwelling unit?
We did not build in an accessory dwelling unit capacity. We did look into that and looked at other studies and how they incorporated it. And essentially that would be an assumption around how many you'd get built out over the next 20 years. That's not something we added in. If the city anticipates that being a real major number in your ADU program and how you've structured it, that might be something you consider with the sub-area plan as additional capacity, but it's not reflected here.
Thank you.
And I would just say building an accessory dwelling unit is typically SEPA exempt, but I don't know in terms of accounting for how much growth we see within the sub-area plan, whether we need to account for that as part of the total amount of permitting activity that can take place under the planned action EIS. So that's something to be considered, at least as maybe an assumption that gets built into the sort of I think it's kind of a quota that we're using for new development under the sub-area plan and planned action.
Great. And so, Rob, you had said this is going to come in front of the full council tomorrow. Was Mark going to be presenting tomorrow as well? Not. Oh, this will not. I thought you said it was.
The marketing and
Communications.
Communication plan. Well, what my plan for this was, because this is part of a bigger body of work. You guys are just getting a bite of the process. With your permission, I would email this because there's lots of good data in here, but we've identified that some of the capacity analysis in this sub area still needs some work. So with your permission, I would forward this to the entire council with a note that that interesting data here for you to look at, but the capacity analysis in the sub area still needs some work. Staff and the consultant will work on the issues identified in the meeting, and then encourage the other council members to watch this video to get more information about the presentation.
Yeah, I think, no, that's perfect. And then, you know, as I give a committee report, I can kind of highlight that and again, further encourage them to take a look at this. Again, it's draft one, more to come, but I think it's a lot of great information.
What I see in it that I think will be perceived well by our citizens is that where we see capacity, the potential for absorbing the density and the capacity is not right downtown. I look at it and there's a lot on Bethel going up from West Bay to the bowling alley. There's a lot right there just across from the South Kitsap Mall. And then there are pockets of parcels in the major, or what we would, from the government center downtown. Anyway, I'm pleased with where I'm seeing the capacity would be developed.
I agree with you.
Yep.
Yeah.
So one final note, just so the committee is aware, we're getting ready to start our public outreach on this. I believe our survey is nearing.
I owe that back to you, yes.
And we also are setting up a city webpage for this type of information and for links to the survey or notices. So I think once this report is finalized, it will go onto the project website and as well as any results from the survey that we're getting ready.
Great. Well, thank you for the presentation this morning.
I have just one more question. We've talked a lot about COVID and the office space and people using more telecommuting and that sort of stuff. My question is, how will it affect density, do you think? Because those of us living in single family homes, it's easier to isolate yourself than it is if you're living in a multifamily unit.
You know, I think that's a good question. And I you know, in terms of whether multifamily high density product is impacted by the need for social distancing, my gut is that that's not going to be a direct impact. I think it might be more about the amenities and how buildings are designed from the standpoint of those common area spaces and how people are looking at those.
You know,
Mitch, you probably have some insight on this, yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's a really interesting discussion point. You know, GGLO, where the vast majority of our work is housing in you know, various forms. You know, and we like to say we do. If it's not a hospital or a prison and there's a bed, we do it. And so we've had that discussion internally, and you know, I'm optimistic that this is a short-term, you know, relatively change, and that, you know, eventually we'll move on past this as we have with past pandemics, and it won't have a long-term impact on the bigger picture. But as we do look at multifamily housing, you know, I think Mark touched on a good point that we've been in discussions with, is how you start to design some of these units and the amenity spaces that can allow for more social distancing. And then also, you know, is this an opportunity that we need to provide, be better providing individual amenity spaces or outdoor opportunities for outdoor spaces. So more balconies and decks on units, so people can still get access to the outdoors without having to go to a shared roof deck, or things similar to that. I think are important. It's really being evident now where some parks are getting shut down, and people living in multifamily projects or buildings maybe don't have access to the outdoors that the other ways would have, or that a single family homeowner might have. So I think it's getting into some of the details of the buildings that way that where we'd see the biggest impact, I guess.
Yeah, I think you're right. The like Spyglass is an example. I think the rooftop gardens and your open spaces that are part of and built in and part of and workout facilities and stuff are becoming more common in the developments that I went and toured.
Yeah.
It resonates with me too. The fact that affordable housing will still be top of mind as we move into the future, I think will continue to drive these types of multifamily dwellings.
Yeah.
Okay, any other comments on this? What a great initial report. Thank you so much for the work.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Perfect. I just have one more question for the group here. It got brought up earlier just about, post-COVID and just kind of our local businesses. Is anyone hearing from local businesses that are considering not reopening? I haven't really heard that. Is anyone else hearing that?
I haven't heard. I think it's got to be a reality, but I haven't heard of anyone in particular saying they're throwing. I have one, the swim deck. I've heard secondhand information that the swim deck is not going to reopen.
And I don't think that was COVID related, though.
No, that was
ready to be done anyway.
Yeah, I think it was the
health.
Yeah, he had health issues. He got reopened, and then this was kind of, I think, the straw that broke the camel's back. And I have I'm very concerned that we need to get our retail open back up and be treating all of our retailers equally, and we all need to have, but these are some issues beyond our control. I mean, this is the governor's order, but doggone it, if Walmart can be open, with, proper PPEs and things, well, then why can't some other retailer in a diminished capacity?
Yeah, I'm right there with you. It's weird to think we can have thousands of people through one store, but we can't have dozens through another. Okay, well, anything else for the good of the order, or are we ready to adjourn?
And I'll have this email out here in 10 minutes to the full council. And sorry to the three of you, you're in the all council members category, so you're going to get it too.
Perfect. All right, everyone. Well, thank you for your time today, and we'll see some of you soon, and some of you sooner than others tomorrow. Bye. This meeting is adjourned.